Welcome back, everybody. This Week in America on the Blue Funk Broadcasting Radio Network. Great to have you on the program today. Our special guest is B.D. Salerno, author of the book Forensic by the Stars, Astrology Investigates. B.D., welcome to the program. I'm looking forward to this. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me, Rick.
You've been studying, as I mentioned, astrology for over 20 years, focusing on forensic astrology. Let's talk about that because that's a fairly new term to people that don't follow astrology real closely. What are we talking about with forensic astrology?
Well, actually, I'm going to back up a little bit and explain to the listeners that there are many branches of astrology that serve various purposes. The one we're particularly referring to is event astrology, where an event happens, such as there's a train wreck or there's a signing into law of a new bill, the time of any important event, and you can construct a horoscope and it will describe that event and the surrounding circumstances of that event. So astrologers have been doing that for many, many years. There's a chart for the signing of the Constitution of the United States. There's a chart for the Declaration of World War II, etc. But a lot of people have done this before me, but nobody's really written extensively about it, is if you can also do an event chart for a tragic event or a crisis like a crime or a murder. And it will describe the circumstances of that situation as it would anything else that you would cast a chart for. And I first discovered that when I was studying a branch of astrology which is called horary. And that is basically, horary means hour, and it is a form of astrology used for hundreds and hundreds of years that its purpose is to answer questions. You can actually answer questions with astrology. And I was studying that, and because that's based on the time that a question is asked, I was like, well, if I can get an answer to a question, I can get an answer to an event that happened that we don't have all the details about just yet, or that which are not yet apparent. So I started reading in some of the books I read where astrologers actually had done charts for famous crimes. Now, for many years, I've been a crime buff. I've read all, Anne Rule's books and all the crime writers. I just seem to be attracted to things that are mysterious, things that you want to know more about.
Yeah, in a lot of cases, these were conclusions or outcomes that really didn't make a whole lot of sense to most of the public. And to you, it's like, that just doesn't ring true to me.
Yeah, that happened with a lot of my early charts. And when I was studying the horary astrology, and I found out, there were some astrologers that were writing about famous crimes, and they were figuring out who did them. In particular, one astrologer wrote a book that influenced me tremendously called The Astrologer Looks at Murder. She wrote it around 1964, and her name was Barbara Waters. Of course, being a true crime buff and an amateur sleuth and all that, I was like, I had to read that book. And I read it, and I was fascinated by the technique she was describing. So Barbara Waters took the event chart, which is the horoscope cast for a specific place and time, for one of the Jack the Ripper murders in London back in 1888. And she actually developed a profile of the killer, and it matched one of the prime suspects. Of course, we still don't know who did all that, but there's still a lot of, there's a good handful of prime suspects for those murders, and possibly more than one individual. So I saw that, and I was just blown away. I thought, I really need to study this because it kind of married two of my biggest hobbies, which were true crime and astrology. At the time, I had a roommate who was a history major, and she was doing a paper on the Charles Lindbergh Jr. kidnapping, which took place in New Jersey, not far from where I live. I grew up, and I'm living in New Jersey right now. And so, of course, that case was very well known to the locals and in New Jersey history. They still have trials, reenactments of the trial at the Flemington County Courthouse to this day of that trial. And at that trial, a German immigrant, Bruno Hauptmann, was convicted and, of course, unfortunately sent to the electric chair for the kidnapping and murder. And there's been a lot of controversy over the years. Did he really do this? Because the work seemed to be, it had to involve more than one person. And he was so adamant about not being involved, and nobody believed his alibi, and nobody would come forward except his wife. And of course, her testimony was discounted completely because they figured she was just trying to protect him. So my very first forensic horoscope was of the Lindbergh kidnapping. I had to do some research to get all the information I needed. But when I did that horoscope, I was completely blown away by my findings, and I was just committed to doing this kind of work. I just felt like there's something to this that is so important and needs more study. So that's actually the discussion of that crime is in the introduction to my book, Forensics by the Stars.
And it's fascinating as you read that. The book is Forensic by the Stars. The website is forensicbythestars.com. When you go about doing something like that, and that's something that we've all read and vaguely remember about the Lindbergh baby situation, what date do you use? I would assume there's so many different dates that you could choose in there. How do you go about finding a date? And then you talked before about the charts will describe and tell you things. How does that happen? What all goes into the equation?
Well, actually, what a chart really is you can visualize a horoscope as it looks like a pie chart. It's got 12 sections to it, and those sections are the 12 houses of experience. Everything that happens to us in life belongs to one of these houses of experience. For example, there's a house that rules your children. It also rules your creativity because it's creation. A child is a creation. And another house rules your marriage partner, your business partner. It also rules the perpetrator that commits a crime. These houses have literally hundreds of meanings. So when you are making a horoscope, you are taking a specific date and a specific time, like 11:35 a.m. in Kansas City, Missouri. If something happened then, you would do it for that time. And what is represented on that in the pie chart, so to speak, the horoscope, are the positions of planets, the sun and moon, and various stars. And they form certain geometric patterns within that which have meaning throughout the centuries from antiquity. These meanings were studied and assigned. And each planet and star just represents particular energies. They have so many meanings, but for example, the moon rules the home. The moon can rule the mother, it can rule the feminine, can rule women. The moon can rule the passage of an event. It rules fertility in a chart if you're looking to see if someone wants to have a child. And on and on. Mercury rules communications, which we would understand because we sort of associate Mercury with something fast,
right,
and with a message. Venus is said to be the planet of love, pleasure, and it rules money. It rules things that we enjoy. And so when you look at how these are all configured and what house they're in and what sign they're in, you get a pattern of either favorable energies in certain areas or unfavorable. And in a crime, which is a crisis, basically, you generally see unpleasant things happening. It tells you the story of what happened. Somebody being murdered is not going to be a pleasant-looking chart, and they never are. So based on what all these different planets and houses represent, you can begin to construct a scenario of what happened. Of course, intrinsic in what I'm saying is how hard this is, because you have to figure out of all the things that the planets mean, which one am I going to decide upon? So you have to look at specific areas, for example, what rules that circumstance. If you're looking at friends, you would look at the 11th house. And if there's a difficult planet or situation in the 11th house, there's a problem there with friendships.
Well, the process is so fascinating. Mm-hmm. The book is Forensic by the Stars. B.D. Salerno, our guest on the program today, Astrology Investigates. The website is forensicbythestars.com. Information at our website, thisweekinamerica.us. It's fascinating, and you've been active I want to come back to another case here in a second, but you've been active in working with investigators, with detectives on some cold cases. How receptive are they to working with you and the information that you pass on to them?
Well, the fact that they found me which the only way they could have found me in the past few years when I did work with a couple people was through my blogs on the internet, which I was writing blogs before I actually put the book together. And they were receptive, or they wouldn't have gone through the trouble of looking me up. I worked with a couple of different investigators on very cold cases where they had almost no information, and that was kind of my training wheels, because I was just coming into really working on this and writing about my findings. So while they were receptive enough to contact me, then they went to the extreme of asking, extremely specific things. And my response to that was, gee, if you think we can read all of that, why didn't you come to us before? Why don't you employ astrologers routinely? Because the more information I could glean out of a horoscope, the more the investigator would come back and ask for. It put me to quite a challenge, and it really forced me to try and see just how far can we go. And I'm still trying to learn, how far can we go with this? How much can we discern from the horoscope? I mean, generally, it tells me everything I need to know.
Let's go to...
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, finish.
I was going to say, taking into account that it can, the astrology does describe physical characteristics, I'm now trying to figure out how far can I go in describing a possible suspect. So people have been receptive, although mixed with a healthy dose of skepticism, which is fine, because I certainly understand that this is really hard to believe, first of all.
Well, yes.
And you also have to be very good at what you're doing, or they will not come back. You have to give valuable information. So I welcome that as a challenge, working with investigators, and they've basically been very nice about it, very open-minded.
In the book Forensic by the Stars, as you walk through some of these cases, it makes sense, the progression you're going through. Well, let's talk about the Marilyn Monroe situation. We're running out of time in the program, but this is something that you said has been bothering you for a long time. Was it suicide? Was it a murder? The chapter in your book is called The Murder of Marilyn Monroe.
Yes.
A lot of great information in there, and you were just not comfortable with this. It was a suicide.
I never was, even as a child, because she, as I wrote in the book, she was quite popular in my family, and I just didn't buy it. This woman was at the peak of her career. She was really going places. She was probably the most famous woman in the world. In some ways, she still is. Everybody would recognize her photograph now.
Yes.
And I just couldn't believe it. It just seemed too pat, and there were investigations over the years that were reopened in Los Angeles, and never to anyone's real satisfaction. So when I took that one on, I read 3 or 4 books before I started working on it, because I just really wanted to know the whole background. The fun of this for me is not just doing the astrology. I love doing research, and I love reading biographies. So it requires me to put all that together when I'm doing a forensic horoscope. And it was a difficult chart to work on, because there were so many things going on. There were just so many things going on the night that she died, and so many individuals. There were many people in her house that night that we didn't really know about. So I pushed myself on that one, because I really wanted to know, and now I'm satisfied with my conclusion that it was murder.
Like I said, that starts off the chapter, and it goes back through some of the witnesses, and the witnesses' stories later were proven to be inaccurate, that type of thing. In fact, when you go back to the Lindbergh situation, I was shocked to find out that the senior Lindbergh basically ran the investigation. He was the one that was calling the shots.
He did, and it was just a weird thing that the New Jersey State Police had only been founded within a year of that crime. They were a fledgling group. The head of it happened to be the father of General Norman Schwarzkopf, who was famous for Desert Storm.
Right.
And his father was running the New Jersey State Police when it first opened. And in those days, we have to realize Charles Lindbergh was a god. He walked on water. People adored him. He was enormously popular. And they wanted to, I guess the state police was looking for approval or some sort of credibility, and they thought they were doing a great service by putting him in control of the investigation, which was botched from start to finish. He told them, "Oh no, don't look for fingerprints on the windowsill." Well, they thought the kid went out the windowsill with the kidnapper, but he didn't want it fingerprinted. So it cast some suspicion on what was going on that night. I personally don't think the child was taken through the window after studying up on that. But I definitely feel that people within the household were involved. Definitely servants. I think it was the work of a gang. I really don't think Hauptmann had anything to do with it except being stuck with the silver certificates that were passed to him by another suspicious individual who died before he could be investigated.
The book is fascinating. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but we will have BD back on the program. She's working on a new book, Forensics by the Stars, Astrology Investigates. You lay all of this out, and it's interesting. In this book, you talk about TWA Flight 800, that crash, the Pan Am crash, Boeing 747, back in July of 1996. Didn't make a lot of sense at the time. It's back in the news. You said you've never been comfortable with that, and you've investigated that, and that's in the book. And then, again, the Natalie Wood situation is in the new book you're writing, and that's been back in the news because that just didn't make a whole lot of sense, and that keeps resurfacing as well.
Right.
So there'll be a lot to talk about in the next program, a lot in this book, Forensic by the Stars, Astrology Investigates. BD, thank you so much for joining us on the program. We look forward to having you back. Excellent job in explaining this for everybody. And it really sort of like now when you look at it, it's sort of another tool in the toolbox for law enforcement now. And I'm glad they're paying some attention to it.
Oh, yes, that's one of my goals, to be able to spread the word about it so that it can be used by investigators. If they use psychics with some degree of success, then they can turn to astrologers as well.
Well, and the nice thing is, when you read the book, you get to B, but we find out how you got there. We find out what A is before you get to B, so it makes a logical sequence as we're studying that. The book is Forensics by the Stars. BD Salerno has been our guest on This Week in America. The website is forensicbythestars.com. Thank you for joining us. Look forward to having you back in the program.
Thank you, Rick. It's been my pleasure.
You're listening to This Week in America on the Blue Funk Broadcasting Radio Network.